the moral, the ethical, the intellectual, the astral, the cosmic, the celestial, house not made with hands.
The alchemical axiom or principle of vitriol. Visita interiora terrae, rectificando inveniis occultum lapidum. Visit the interior of the earth, and rectifying therein, you will find the hidden stone.
You know, if you don't transmute yourself first, you will transmute nothing.
The axiom of fixing the volatile and volatilizing the fixed.
Being able to weave hermetic principles into our social fabric.
Filling in the fractal spaces till we get to the most rarefied abstract plane of the celestial realm.
You know, that's alchemy, that's understanding nature.
Question everything.
Symbols are far beyond words, right? Symbols are the touch point where the mind enters into the sublime, incomprehensible, translinguistic depths of a direct connection with the ultimate that I would refer to as the divine.
There is truth in the Western esoteric traditions. It has been contributed to and refined and evolved over the course of millennia by what we can conceive universally to be the greatest minds to ever exist.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Philosophical Minds Podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric. From the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all, join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, tonight I'm joined with John Apollonius Opsopaus. He's a PhD, translator, author, magical practitioner. He's a retired university professor with over 45 years of experience reading ancient Greek and Latin. And yeah, so you are a practitioner, is that correct as well?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And is there anything else additional that you would like to add about your background or yourself?
Maybe just that I've been a practicing neo-pagan for, I don't know, some 40 odd years, I guess. And so that's connected with really it's the basis for a lot of my other activities.
Excellent. Yeah, I found out about you originally because I was having conversations with a buddy of mine, and he's really into the Greek literature and stuff, and kept occasionally bringing up the name Platon. Surfaced numerous times in our discussions. So that got me curious to dig a little bit deeper, and I came across your work. So yeah, maybe I can ask you just in general, if you can kind of give a general introduction to Platon, like who he was, what was he known for, the kind of time frame, any of that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. His birth name, I guess you would say, was George Gemistos. He was born, we don't know exactly when, maybe like 1355, something like that, or a little earlier, in Constantinople. And he later migrated to Mistras in the Peloponnese, near ancient Sparta. And the reason that people are interested in him, I think, is that he was a proponent of the philosophy of Plato when in the West, the Catholic Church in particular based a lot of its theology on Aristotle. And he, after he came to Mistra, he was involved in the uh, Council of Florence and Ferrara that was intended or was trying to heal the schism in the Christian church that had been in existence for something like a millennium. And so there were scholars and theologians and others from the Orthodox branch of the Christian church and the Catholic branch of the Christian church. And they came together to try and hash this out, which they didn't, as it turns out. But he was part of the Greek delegation. And so when he was in Florence, he gave some lectures on Platonism. Now, the story is, and there seems to be some truth to the story, um, but historians quibble about the detail. But the story is that Lorenzo de' Medici heard his lectures on Plato and was so impressed by them that some 30 years later, he founded a Platonic Academy in Florence and put Marsilio Ficino in charge of it and told Ficino to start translating all of Plato's works into Latin. Um, and as is pretty well known about this time, because this was after the fall of Constantinople, um, and people were leaving Constantinople and the Byzantine areas with a lot of Greek manuscripts, the Corpus Hermeticum was brought to the West, and de' Medici said, "Well, hold off on the Plato. This is really more interesting. Go ahead and translate the Corpus Hermeticum," which he did. So, arguably, these lectures that um, uh, Gemistos, I'll call him at this stage, gave um, uh, were indirectly responsible for what really became the Italian Renaissance and the rebirth of Renaissance Platonism, or the birth of Renaissance Platonism. So, and then all of the things that followed after that, Renaissance magic and many of the spiritual and artistic traditions that flowed out from that. So he's important in those terms. He was a very highly respected philosopher in his day, especially as an expert on Platonism, and he defended in a number of his writings Plato's philosophy as superior to Aristotle's. Um, now the interesting thing about him, beyond that, is that it was discovered after he died, although it was suspected while he was alive, that he essentially had developed what I think we can safely call a neo-pagan religion uh, based on Platonism. And he wrote a comprehensive manual, you might say, for this religion, um, which he called his Book of Laws. And the book was discovered after his death, and after some passing back and forth, a churchman who was later the patriarch of the Orthodox Church burned a good hunk of it, probably about 2/3 of it, and preserved just enough, as he said, to sort of prove the crime. Because he'd been accusing, um, and I'll call him Plethon. He adopted that, which is the Byzantine pronunciation of his name. He adopted that, what we might now call neo-pagan name, for himself, um, um, uh, presumably as a proponent or as a practitioner of this religion. So the churchman had been accusing him of basically being a pagan for many years. And essentially, when the book was discovered after his death, it proved it, in effect. And so, as he says, he preserved just enough of the book to prove the crime. And so that's what we've got. And so I think he's very interesting for a number of figures. He's kind of a heroic figure, because here he was at a time when, being a heretic would get you cruelly tortured and executed. and other people that had pagan leanings were, in fact, tortured and executed and pursued across the whole Roman Empire. He developed this religion, which we think he probably practiced with a small number of followers in Mistra. And so, for those of us that are practicing neo-paganism now, and in particular those of us like me who does this in the Greek tradition, this is very interesting because this is somebody that, something like 600 years ago did exactly what we're trying to do now, basically based on ancient practices, but also brought up to date, construct a religion basically that um, uh, worships the Greek gods. And he did it. He was an excellent philosopher. In fact, people said that he was the best philosopher since Plato and Plotinus. And so he was very highly respected in his day. So he's a good philosopher. He knew his stuff. He knew the Platonic philosophy, which was really the most credible pagan theology at the time. And he also knew Greek civilization. He knew the myths, he knew the practices, and so forth. And so he was very well placed to construct a neo-pagan religion centered around the Greek gods. And so that makes him very interesting, I think, for modern neo-pagans. Now, the problem was that the remnants of his Book of Laws had not been translated into English. There was a French translation dating back to the 19th century, and there was the original Greek, of course, of the remaining fragments, but there was no complete translation, and so that was very frustrating. And I had been waiting, well, probably close to 40 years for somebody to get around and actually translate the thing, and nobody had done it. And so finally, a few years ago, I decided to just do it myself, and
Thank you.
and I did. So, and it was a lot of work, but it was also a real educational experience too, because there's nothing like translating to force you to read the text very closely and really try and understand what it says. And so that's what I did. So I published or through Llewellyn a book a couple of years ago. I'm just trying to remember the date.
The Platon, his
Yeah.
laws book.
Well, so it's no, so the Wellen book, I'll hold it up here briefly. It's called Hellenic
Oh,
Polytheism,
okay.
a practical guide to the restored pagan religion of George Gemistos Plethon. So what that book is it presents his religious system, which we understand in quite a bit of detail because Scholarius wanted to preserve the parts that he thought were damning in terms of neo-pagan practice. And so it's actually, quite a bit of the ritual details and the hymns and the invocations and all of this stuff is actually, a lot of that has been preserved. And so, but still, it's a 600-year-old text translated from Byzantine Greek. So what I do is in the book is I present it as a practical system of practice. I explain it. I give background information. I give advice in terms of how to actually do this as part of an active religious practice and so forth. And so the first, I don't know, half of the book or 2/3 of the book is my explanations of his whole theological system and the religious practice and tables and all sorts of things to help you actually practice it. And then the last part of the book is just a translation of the surviving parts of his Book of Laws. And I also included his translation, which hadn't been done since the 1600s,
Wow.
into English, of his commentary on the Chaldean oracles, which were quite fundamental to his thinking, as it
And
was to all Neoplatism.
Yeah. Did he have a name for this religion that he developed?
No, not as far as we can tell. Now, of course, the problem is because he never made this book public, and it was only discovered after his death. We don't know what his intention was. Um, some people who can't imagine he was an actual practicing neo-pagan say, "Oh, it was just kind of some sort of literary experiment, or some sort of flight of fantasy or something like that." But it's quite clear that he's thought it out carefully. It's intended to be a practical book. He's got, practical advice for, what happens. He's got some prostrations in there, and he talks about, well, if what happens if you can't prostrate, if you've got some physical disabilities, well, what do you do? So he's clearly thought through the practical aspects of it. So I think it's obvious that at least he was practicing this religion, and there is some evidence that he had a small group of practitioners working in secret with him. But the book itself, doesn't particularly give any name to this religion. It just kind of presents it as the true religion. And he says, we can call these gods anything, and he says it's really a matter of convenience that we use the Greek names of the gods, because that's our heritage. But in that sense, it's not a specifically Greek religion. It's a Neoplatonic theology, basically.
Hmm. And uh, what were some of the aspects of his works that were burned? Do we know, like what they contained?
Yeah, well, one of the fortunate things we have is a complete table of contents. So
Oh, nice.
it was probably written on the inside front cover, or maybe the first page of the book, in which um, he recorded all of this stuff, or in which he wrote all this stuff. And so we have a complete table of contents, so we know exactly what we're missing in terms of topics. They're mostly theoretical topics. There's several chapters on daimons, which would be really nice to have. He talks a little about them in the other chapters, but he obviously had quite a bit to say about them beyond that. I'm trying to think what else is missing. Um, they're mostly what you might call theoretical chapters, because again, what was considered most damning was the actual practice. You could talk about this stuff, and not get in too much trouble. You could always put in some extra words that said, "Of course, I don't believe this," or "Of course, this is all rubbish," and get away with it. But when you actually started describing practices, and especially if you started doing the practices, then you could really get in trouble.
Mhm.
So that's the good thing for us, is that's what's preserved. But yeah, there's a number of I've got it here in front of me, and I also and you may be familiar with this. I have also published, self-published basically, a side-by-side translation of the Greek and English.
Mm.
Um,
And another book you have, I believe it's the Platon's Laws, a summary of the doctrines of Zoroaster and Plato. Does this contain different information than the Hellenistic polytheism one?
no, no. So there's several works here that are all kind of relevant. There's his Book of Laws, or is it nomoi in Greek, is laws. Uh, Probably in that name is probably inspired by Plato's Laws. But anyway, so there's that Book of Laws, and that's, I don't know, it's probably 100 pages long in translation, something like that. It's a pretty substantial work, and again, I'm just talking about the surviving part. Um, then he has a very short summary of his theological system, and that's what you were just referring to. Um, and it's just a couple pages long. Um, and that's very useful too. That survives in whole, but it's very short, and it summarizes basically all of his theological principles in 12 principles. Then there's actually two surviving commentaries on the Chaldean oracles. There's a very brief one, And then there's a more extensive one that kind of goes through his collection of oracles. He had 36 of them, as I recall. And he has a short commentary, some short, some longer commentary on each of these 36 Chaldean oracles, which were very important to the Neoplatonists. And so we have that. And like I said, that's kind of provides background also for his religion. What else do we have? We have his book on virtues, which is not especially pagan, but it's certainly not Christian. It's basically a classical system of virtues, and it turns out it's coordinated with the Book of Laws, something I don't think anyone has noticed before. But he has a whole set of hymns in the Book of Laws that have survived, fortunately, all of them, and some of the hymns are also coordinated with the way he structures this system of virtues.
Wow.
What else? So there's his paper, basically, or monograph on the differences between Plato and Aristotle. Um, um, that's just really pure philosophy. There's not really, it helps interpret some of the religious stuff, but it's not specifically religious. And that was published and widely distributed during his lifetime. And he wrote a bunch of other stuff too. He wrote some funeral orations. There's a number of letters. He wrote some historical stuff. He wrote some stuff on like fortifications, how to, because he was an advisor to the emperor, and on fortifying the Peloponnese and stuff like that. So there's a lot of other stuff that's not especially relevant to his religion. He did his own edition of Herodotus,
Oh,
in
wow.
which so
What were some of the interesting things that he had to say about the Chaldean oracles, like with his commentary?
well, he basically um, interprets them as describing the structure of the soul. Really is really one of the most important things. So he describes the soul, and this is again is consistent with his laws, that there's a immortal part of the human soul, and that it's when we're embodied, when we're incarnated, we have a vehicle of our soul, and again, this is sort of standard Platonic stuff, uh, and there's a sort of a glue, if you like, that holds, which is an ethereal soul that uh, holds the immortal soul in this soul vehicle. And a soul vehicle is sort of a quasi-material thing because a soul has to have a vehicle. But it's that then is what is essentially attaches the soul to the physical body. And he talks about the structure of all of these different aspects of the soul and what this means in terms of the descent of the soul into the body and then its ascent again at death. And depending on how you read it, whether you can make this ascent while you're still alive too. I think he implies that because there are several cases where he, for instance, talks about how it's beneficial for your health. So that wouldn't apply if you're already dead. So um, um, I think, in fact, he had some notion of doing a kind of theurgical ascent of the soul. But it's most directly it's about the structure of the soul and the stuff that goes with it. Now some of this is important because this ethereal vehicle is also the vehicle of the imagination, and the imagination is where symbols reside, which he says, and again this is quoting the Chaldean oracles, are put there by the gods. So he says the gods implant symbols into our souls, but specifically into our ethereal vehicles. And so that again, that would be important in theurgy because we would be making use of those symbols to put ourselves in contact with the gods.
Yeah. And did he express in any of his writings that you found any opinions or descriptions of his views on things like reincarnation, or is it metempsychosis? Is that the Greek term for
Yeah,
that? Did he
yeah,
have
he
anything?
was firmly committed to it, and in fact, he gave argument, and it survives also. Again, probably because it was considered heretical by Christians. They didn't burn that part, but no, he basically said that the number of souls is fixed, which is not too bizarre an attitude for the sort of the late Middle Ages in which he lived. Um, and that, in fact, this is kind of an interesting thing that what was it? Humans had an essential cosmological role because he said basically you've got the gods and they're outside of time and space, they're eternal. You've got all of the stuff in the material realm where things are coming to be and passing away. Everything is temporal, everything is temporary, and so forth. But to have a unified cosmos, you kind of have to have, and this is again a Pythagorean principle, you had to have sort of an intermediate element that had elements in common with each of the two opposites to join them together. And he said the human soul provides that because we become embodied, and to act in a sense, we have to be embodied. But then when we die, our soul goes back again to this eternal realm to be then later embodied again. And part of his argument for that was, well, there's only a finite number of souls, and so you kind of got to keep recycling the souls,
Mm.
to maintain this connection forever. And so yeah, so he very much believed in reincarnation, um, and he talked about that, and there was a sense that people would get better from one lifetime to a next, but obviously, in general, no memory of previous lifetimes.
Mm.
So the memory presumably was embodied in those aspects of the body that don't survive from one incarnation to the next.
Yeah. Were his the virtues that he wrote about, were those pretty in line with like the Neoplatonic virtues?
Yeah, very much so. He well, a little different, but so what he had were the four classical cardinal virtues. But then each one of those was divided into three species.
Mm-mm.
Um, and so overall it was a system of 12 virtues. And they were kind of, it's not exactly, the correspondence is not perfect, but it looks like one level was sort of had to do with you on a personal level. The next level, um, depending on which direction you're going, was more your social relations. And the third level had to do with your relations to the gods and the universe as a whole. So there was sort of a ranking of these sub virtues into these three different ranks, but classified under the four cardinal virtues. Now, it's a little different from the Neoplatonists. The Neoplatonists typically had a ladder of virtues where they had the four cardinal virtues and they reinterpreted them on successively higher levels. You know, Depending on the philosopher, there might be four or five or six different levels. Um, um, and so courage on one level, on the sort of the lowest level would be what Aristotle and most other people would mean by courage or fortitude. Not being cowardly and not being foolhardy. So some sort of mean between the two. Courage on the next higher level would be the courage to detach from your body, to essentially be willing to separate from your body and um, have the fortitude to do that. So all and prudence or wisdom would be interpreted on higher levels also. Um, so it's a little different, similar idea of a scale or ladder of virtues, but he had his own version of it. And like I said, then in his hymns, some of his hymns, he goes through all of the virtues in order, and um, once you see it, it's very clear that he cites each of the virtues. You know, maybe I don't know. I think like a line of each of a hymn to each of these sub virtues. It's not a whole lot, but it's a way of sort of reminding yourself of what your goal should be as a
Yeah.
person.
Did I hear you mention on one of your interviews something about the hymns and in relation to music that he had in there, that he how the hymns the music that goes to him or something like that, or
Well, yeah, I don't know exactly what you heard.
Uh,
We don't have there's no music in the manuscripts that
oh,
we have.
okay.
And now the hymns are all exactly 9 lines long. And they're in basically heroic hexameters, like Homer. Um, and so they're very singable in a sense. And Now what I did in my book um, is I suggested some ways you could improvise or compose music to go with them. And I talked a little bit in very, very general terms about Byzantine music, what Byzantine music would be at that time. And it'd be, a little bit like Gregorian chant. Now, whether he just recited the hymns, whether he actually sang them to some kind of melody, um, who knows? We have no evidence of that.
Yeah.
And um, and of course, a modern person could do the same thing, either just recite them like poetry, or um, and I did translate them in verse for that purpose, or compose some kind of music, even modern music.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, unfortunately, we don't have any of the music itself,
Uh,
if it exists.
yeah. I thought that the Zoroastrian connection that was really interesting to me. Well, what's the description that is kind of laid out with the general um chain of transmission from Zoroaster to Plathon?
Well, this was kind of standard Platonic lore,
Mm.
is that the um, the Platonists in general viewed um, the Persians and in particular the Zoroastrians and the Magi as being great spiritual masters. Um, and There are all sorts of stories about, Magi being present when Plato was born and
Oh,
so forth.
interesting.
And, almost all of the philosophers in their biographies end up making some trip or trying to make a trip to the East, to study with the Persians, and also to Egypt, of course, and often to study with Hindu sages too. Um, so um, I think this is the Greeks, at least in the philosophical tradition, really respected the, as they call them, the older civilizations, and they thought they had a lot of wisdom that they could learn. You know, it's been said that the genius of the Greeks was they only stole from the best,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
and that's what they viewed themselves as doing. So there were all of these. There was a tradition, that again there were magi present when Plato died as well. Um, there was uh, this was a common tradition. Pythagoras was supposed to of studied with Zoroaster or studied with Zoroastrians. So this was viewed as being sort of the deep roots of a esoteric kind of religious tradition. Um, and so you know um, then we get into the very interesting historical question about, well, is there anything to this, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I was gonna ask if who are the references uh of Pythagoras studying with the Zoroastrians?
you know, I don't remember offhand, but it's in, you
Yeah.
know, we've got biographies of Pythagoras. I don't know, maybe in Diogenes Laertius, but I don't remember.
Oh,
Um, and it's kind of a, you know, the trouble is it's kind of a it's just an expected thing that when you wrote a biography of a philosopher, and of course a lot of these were written centuries after they lived, you know, one of the things you had them do at a certain age was they traveled all around to all of, you know, they got initiated in all the mysteries, right? They studied with the Egyptian priests, they studied with the Magi, they studied with, you know, all of the respected ones. They got initiated into the Orphic mysteries. This was just something that sort of, to be a biography of a philosopher, it almost had to have that in it. Um, and then, you know, when they were 40 years old or something, they would set up their school and begin teaching other people. So it was just kind of sort of a standard pattern for a philosopher's biography. And so it's, you know, it's kind of hard to tell how much of it is just put in there because that's what you put in, or and how is actually true. But I mean, we do know in some cases, you know, like later with Plotinus, you know, we know that he studied with different teachers in Alexandria, and that he, you know, later went. He tried to go to the east because he wanted to study with the Magi, um, and then he later settled in Rome, and you know, so people did do this, you know, and they certainly did shop around and try and study with different teachers. But you know, it's the further back we go, the more unreliable the evidence is, because we have biographies that have been copied from biographies that have been copied from biographies, you know, and we don't have the original ones in many cases, and a lot of it was all just hearsay to begin with. Um, So, you know, who knows? It seems plausible, you know, as many people have pointed out, Pythagoras has many of the characteristics of a shaman. Um, in his biographies, he's, you know, in contact with various people from further east, more Eastern civilizations. Um, Peter Kingsley has argued that he was initiated in basically a Central Asian um, type of religious tradition. Um, and you know, he was in a place where he could have easily studied with the Magi as well. And so, you know, I think it's quite plausible in the case of Pythagoras that he did, in fact, learn from a lot of these different traditions that were around at the time. And did he study with Zoroaster? Well, no, because they lived at completely different times, as we know now. But he probably studied with some Zoroastrians who
yeah.
would have been still around.
So I heard.
Um,
Oh, go ahead.
well, I was going to say, you know, it was a way of sort of establishing a pedigree, you know,
Yeah,
for your tradition.
yeah. So I heard you mention that Platon talks about terrestrial diamonds, and I guess that I had kind of conceived of diamonds as being something of a celestial nature. But so in Platon's view, are they both celestial as well as terrestrial diamonds, or how's
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in a sense, all of the elements have diamonds, and they're intermediate beings. You know, they're now again, unfortunately, the chapters that discuss them in detail were destroyed. But from what he has written, they're intermediate beings. They're definitely in time and space. They're not uh, the gods, the super celestial gods are outside of time and space. The celestial gods are in time and space, but because they're effectively planets, they're in eternal motion. The daimons are at a lower level. They're in the air, and they live on the earth, and they are in time and space. And some of them are even mortal.
Hmm.
But basically, and this is pretty much of a traditional view, a Platonic view anyway, that they're sort of the workers that carry out uh, communication between gods and humans, and carry out the work of the gods, and also help in our communication with the gods.
And so you mentioned a little bit about his view of the gods. I think you said something like it doesn't really matter the names, so it's more of like an archetypal type conception of that.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So his it's a very philosophical kind of approach. Um, so he's got a high god, um, which he calls Zeus, and he says it just because that's what we call the high god. Basically is what he says. And then um, there's it looks a little bit like the Kabbalistic tree of life. There's a series of gods that most of them come in male female pairs, and the first pair is Poseidon and Hera. But Poseidon is the form of forms. So we're talking about Platonic forms here.
Oh, interesting.
Poseidon is the form of forms. Hera is the form of matter. So you see, you've got this polarity between form and matter. But at this very abstract level, these are the forms of form and the forms of matter. And so he says, and then at the next level down, we've got gods that represent the form of identity, the form of difference, uh, and so forth. And Platon says, well, we could call this god the form of difference, but that would be confusing, and kind of abstract. So we'll just call it Artemis, and because that's a familiar name, and it kind of fits. And the kind of is, of course, an interesting question, because some of them it's kind of obvious why he picked it, and others it's not obvious at all, and um, it seems kind of arbitrary.
Yeah.
And again, maybe if we had some of the other parts of the book, he would have explained it in more detail. But he basically says that the names really don't matter, but just for convenience, we'll use these traditional names. And um,
Yeah.
in most cases, he gives no real explanation.
So at this point, are there any untranslated works of Platon left, or have they all that we know of been translated by now into English of what we have?
Well, that's a good question. I am pretty sure that there are some that have not been translated into English, but I don't think they're ones that are so interesting to neo-pagans or non-specialists. So I'm thinking about, maybe some of these funeral orations, and some of um, for instance, his translation of Herodotus. I don't think that's been translated into English.
Hmm.
Uh, a lot of it would be the same as any translation of Herodotus, but he made changes here and there. But his funeral orations and some of his letters and things like that, I'm pretty sure the only translation of them, there may be a French translation. Um, there's Latin translations of most of his stuff. Um, but yeah, there's some stuff. I don't know that there's much that's I would consider that interesting.
Yeah. So you've placed like a lot of your studies on Pythagoreanism, and I wanted to ask you, when it comes to theurgy, is Pythagorean theurgy, is that pretty much like the same as Neoplatonic theurgy, or are there some differences there, or how do they weigh
Well,
up against each other?
yeah, the short answer is we don't know.
Mm.
The problem is that Pythagoras didn't write anything down, as far as we know. or if he did, none of it has survived. We have a lot of stories about Pythagoras, and these are the things that lead us to believe that he was some sort of shaman. He does a lot of the things that shamans traditionally do: bilocation, remembering previous lives, incubating to have prophetic dreams, um, tr traveling magically, on an arrow, all sorts of stuff like that. But these are all stories about him, most of which were written centuries afterwards. Um, so, it's very hard to say exactly what he was teaching. And also, the other thing is it was a secret, so
Yeah.
you basically had to be initiated before you even found out the real stuff from Pythagoras himself. So that's a problem in terms of figuring out exactly what he may have been teaching. Now, the thing is, though, that Plato uh, and a number of the people around Plato, uh, well, Plato, I wouldn't say Plato was a Pythagorean, but he certainly had Pythagorean tendencies, and he was accused of plagiarizing Plato's and Pythagoreans rather.
What would you say some of those tendencies were?
Well, the um, the myth of the cave is very Pythagorean. You know, the emphasis on mathematics. That's pure Pythagoreanism. The Timaeus, the dialogue called a Timaeus, has been called a Pythagorean dialogue. It's just chock full of Pythagorean stuff. I mean, number symbolism, but just sort of the whole cosmological system is Pythagorean. And so there's a lot of stuff like that so he seems to have been thinking about Pythagorean ideas, influenced by them in some cases, maybe sort of even arguing against them in some cases, but engaging with them, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah.
And as we say, we know a number of the people around him were considered Pythagoreans. Um, and arguably a lot of the pre-Socratic philosophers were Pythagorean, Parmenides and Empedocles, for example. Um, and um, so in that sense, Pythagoreanism was almost the philosophical background in which Platonism developed. Now, after Plato, there was a Neo-Pythagorean revival. And so then you find, Middle Platonism and this Neo-Pythagoreanism just being mixed together in all sorts of interesting ways. These people, sometimes the same people were working in both areas. They were obviously talking to each other. So there was just a whole mix that it's often very hard to sort of separate out and classify it as Neo-Pythagorean or um, say Middle Platonic or Neoplatonic. And the other thing too is a lot of Pythagorean writings come from this time, and we don't know if reflects older ideas that have survived in lost texts or been passed down orally, or whether it was new ideas. Uh,
Yeah.
you
So
know,
could you say Middle Platonism revolved around a lot of Neoplatonic Pythagoreanism? Would that be like a
well,
combination
so I
of
mean, technically, Neoplatonism comes after Middle Platonism. So
Oh,
Middle
okay.
so
I
Neoplatonism begins with Plotinus.
I had that
One.
backward. Yeah.
So Middle Platonism is sort of the Platonism
So I
from
guess just
Plato up to Plotinus.
Platonic Pythagoreanism, would that be kind of Middle Platonism?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I would say so.
Interesting.
Um, and so, what was going on is people were trying to understand and develop Plato's ideas. Because all we've got, of course, are the dialogues, and the dialogues, are very indirect in terms of what they seem to be trying to teach. Um, you know, there's a lot of people believe that there's Plato's unwritten um, doctrines, that he taught in his school. Um, and these would have been doctrines that the Middle Platonists further developed. Um, but because they were unwritten, the best we can do is infer what they might have been from indirectly from the dialogues and from later Middle Platonic writings. Um, so this is just the further development of this whole philosophical tradition. Uh, Again, incorporating Pythagorean ideas, incorporating Aristotelian ideas, and ideas from other philosophical traditions as well. Just kind of a big stew pot of philosophical ideas in which Platonism is sort of a central core to it. Um, and that then is really the foundation on which Neoplatonism, uh, properly called, beginning with Plotinus, then develops. So one argument is that Pythagoras was a mystic. Uh, that is pretty clear. Arguably, Parmenides and Empedocles were also mystics, magicians, even. So one argument is that Plato kind of tried to steer philosophy in a little bit more of an intellectual direction with these uh, Socratic kinds of arguments and discussions. And that part of what happened after Plato died, of course, Aristotle went off in his direction, but the later Platonists started sort of pulling Platonism back more into that Pythagorean channel, which was more mystical, more magical, um, more experiential, maybe, than we get from the Platonic dialogues, for example. And that then is in a sense, it's a return to the truer Platonic tradition, or rather Pythagorean tradition, um, from kind of something of a detour that Plato took it on. But nevertheless, they viewed Plato's writings as inspired, and so they always had to be engaged with his writings. They couldn't just ignore it and kind of go off on their own direction.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, if you were to give a definition, how would you define theurgy?
Well, okay, I'd give two definitions. Of course, the etymological definition is God work. So it's God work as opposed to God talk, which is theology. So it's interacting with the gods as opposed to just talking about them. Um, um, I think a more informative definition, which I like, is to say it's magic for spiritual purposes, or magic with spiritual ends. So you're not doing magic to attract a lover or to win the chariot races or bind an enemy or something like that. You're doing magic for some sort of spiritual purpose, which typically would be, engaging with the gods in some way, or diamonds too. Of course, in the Platonic tradition, diamonds are not evil, so um, you certainly might want to engage with them.
So,
Uh,
what are some of your personal, like, favorite or most interesting theurgic traditions historically that you've come across and kind of really gravitate towards?
well, so I mean, I think, the one that I come back to most is what we have in Iamblichus, because he really gives the theory of theurgy and explains how it works and fundamentally how to do it. Um, and so that's really what I keep coming back to. Plotinus also has some suggestions, basically, on some different theurgical practices, but basically, I think a version of what Iamblichus does is probably what I find most works best for me. Um, And but I use, for instance, Proclus's hymns, which I found very useful. They are theurgical hymns. They were for that purpose, and so I do that too. But now, getting out of the Greek tradition, um, I find Tibetan deity yoga to be, a very similar kind of theurgical practice. Obviously, the deities are different and the symbols are different, but I think the fundamental practice is exactly the same, and the ends, the purposes, I think, are exactly the same too. I've also written that I think, Jungian active imagination is essentially a theurgical practice, and Jung said that too. So that's sort of a modern, um, um, in a modern theurgical practice in a psychological clothing, if you like. Um, and I think I think again, because it's separated from any particular religious or spiritual tradition, that the um, analytical psychologists have kind of figured out what the core principles are. And they're exactly what Iamblichus said. That's the interesting thing, of course. Um, so, but they've kind of been able to figure out what's going on in more contemporary terms. So those would be probably the primary ones that I've been interested in.
Yeah. So something like Merkaba mysticism or the chariot literature, would that be considered theurgic as well?
I think so. I think so. I'm not real familiar with it, but it seems to me that
So I
that's
think
that's
there's like a
the practice.
descent and an ascent type
Yeah,
aspect to it where they're
yeah.
working. Yeah. And then I wanted to ask you, what is the difference between theurgy and thaumaturgy? Because I heard that too.
Well, okay. So thaumaturgy is literally wonder working. Okay, so it's a very broad term,
Like
and
miracle working or something like that.
yeah, miracle working. And so it really is a term for any kind of magic, and that could be anything from, just parlor tricks to genuine magic. So I would say that the difference with theurgy is the purpose, that the purpose is spiritual. The purpose is not either just amazing somebody or accomplishing some mundane end you want to accomplish. Um, so theurgy, of course, is a late coinage from the second century, I believe. That and before that, people didn't use the word theurgy, so it's really it was coined by the two Julians, and picked up by the Neoplatonists as a term. Um, but so before that time, people would have probably just called it ritual. When, just like the mysteries, you would have various sorts of initiations and other sorts of rituals. Um, but I think the purpose, spiritual or religious is what distinguishes it from thaumaturgy and also from goetia, which is just sort of, some people might call it low magic or something like that. And I think there's no hard and fast line between them. You know, um, if you're working, trying to get some inspiration from a god so you can earn some money, but you're going to use that money for a good purpose. I don't know. Is that theurgy or is it thaumaturgy? I don't know. So I think, just as we can have multiple motives. And I mean, if you read some of Proclus's theurgical hymns, he'll ask for good health or something like that as part of it too, which, arguably is not a spiritual goal per se. Um, but there's nothing wrong with throwing that in there too, or or asking for good luck and things like that. So I think it's a matter of emphasis. Um, but theurgy is also developed in this more conscious theoretical framework that Iamblichus and Proclus and others have developed, um, because they were interested, they did want to distinguish theurgy from thaumaturgy. They want to say, yeah, we're doing stuff that looks like magic, but it's not the magic those kind of um, um, other folks are doing, those disreputable people. We're doing something that's more important and more valuable and more respectable too. Um, so they were kind of felt obliged, I think, both for their own understanding, but also for justification to say, okay, why are we doing this stuff that looks like magic? Why are we burning incense? Why are we using secret names of the gods? Why are we, doing all of these other things that look a lot of like the same things that magicians do? Well, they described how they worked in terms of tuning your soul to a particular divine energy. And so that allowed them to do it more consciously and actually construct a working practice.
So the Zoroastrian magi, were they theurgists, or do we have information on that, historical sources or anything that would give us or lend any information to whether we would consider them theurgists or thaumaturgists or?
Well, so um, well, first of all, there's the real Zoroastrians, which of course are still around today, and the Zoroastrians of myth. And so um, now I don't know a whole lot about real Zoroastrianism, but I mean, as I do understand that they are ritual. I'm not talking about the laity, so to speak, but the priests are ritual specialists, and they have their fire rituals and so forth that they do. And so in that sense, they are doing a kind of theurgy, because any kind of prayer or ritual is in fact a kind of theurgy. Okay. It may not be consciously theurgy, and it may not be constructed according to, say, Iamblichus theurgical principles, but it is a kind of theurgy.
Mm.
So yes, I think we can say that really the priests of any religion, to the extent that they're doing anything effective, are doing theurgy.
Okay.
And to some extent, people, somebody praying to a saint and burning a candle for a saint, they're doing theurgy. Okay, it's a very simple kind of theurgy.
Yeah.
So so there's what actual honest to goodness Zoroastrians were doing way back then, and are to some degree still doing. Now, the other thing is, what's the reputation of the Zoroastrians in ancient Greece? And I think there they were viewed as being, you know, the having the deep ultimate wisdom about the gods and about theurgical matters. So yes, they would be viewed as theurgical specialists. And so I think this is one reason that um, in the biographies we read about, all of the different philosophers studying with the Zoroastrians, and then we have Zoroaster at the beginning of these philosophical traditions, like Platon's, because he was viewed as being one of the earliest religious reformers. And now again, it's how much of that is historical and how much of it is just sort of back projection is hard to tell. Certainly a lot of it is back projection, because it doesn't seem like when you actually look at it, it doesn't seem like a lot of it actually corresponds to Zoroastrian practices, so far as we know it. Um,
Yeah.
but they got ideas. I think especially places like Alexandria. I think of like the San Francisco Bay Area, the big melting pot of ideas. Everyone's trading ideas and talking to each other about what's the latest thing they heard, the latest healing modality or the latest spiritual tradition, and there's just a big flux of ideas, and nobody's sure where any of this stuff came from, but everybody's sort of trying it out and seeing what works. And I view that was very similar in the ancient world as well, especially in certain places like Alexandria. Um, so it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I don't think any of Platon's philosophy is directly attributable to Zoroaster, even though Zoroaster is the first sage he lists in his Golden Chain. If we trace the ideas, they pretty much all come from the last seven, I think it is, Platonists in his list. Um,
Um, and then so you've got this other book. It's called Tablet of, is it Cabes? Sabes?
Kebes, yes. A
Cabes.
lot of people say Cebes, but
Okay.
Kebes would be
Cabes.
in Greek. Yeah.
So this one was cool. I was listening to you talk about this on an interview too. And yeah, could you maybe just give a little brief description of what that's about and like the contents and all that?
Yeah, so this is a text that I forget the date, maybe you remember what it is. I think it's maybe third or fourth century. We don't know exactly, but based on the language and stuff like that, it's written in Greek. And it's interesting because what it purports to be is a description of an engraved stone, or maybe a painted stone. The Greek is ambiguous. So, we have stories about the Emerald Tablet and all sorts of, Gnostic pillars, engraved with all sorts of great truths. Um, so it's that genre, if you like. So it's a description of this tablet. And so the text, it's a relatively short text. The text, basically what happens is like somebody has written down a story about this visit, how they came to this temple of Kronos. And in this temple of Kronos, they saw this big tablet with strange images engraved on it or painted on it. And they were looking at it, trying to figure out what it all meant. And this old man came up and he says to them, I can explain this to you, but it's dangerous knowledge. If you don't, understand it and really grasp it, it can destroy you. And so, they of course say, okay, you know, we'll try and understand it correctly. Please explain it to us. And so the bulk of the text then is the old man in a little bit of a dialogue form, basically describing this text. And he says, you see here, there are these three rings, and there's people coming in through this gate, and there's babies here, and so he goes through. He points out to the different aspects of the picture, and the people say, well, what does that mean? And so then he goes to explain basically an allegorical meaning for all of these different images. And so this then and then he gets to the end and he basically says, make sure you understand and follow, what you've heard here or what you've learned here, and everything will be good. And so that's kind of the way the text goes. So it's a description of this image, and basically it's an allegorical image, like I said, with several rings, and it's about souls entering into life and the various paths they can follow. Of course, there's the paths of, getting and keeping, basically becoming an economic being and just being interested in how much stuff you can get and how all of the bad things that leads to. And then the truer path, the path to get true education, not false education. So false education is just sort of pointless learning, but true education leads you to the higher rings in this circular structure, and ultimately to happiness, which dwells at the very summit of this thing. So we've got this image, Now, over the centuries, I don't know how many people. I've got probably a 300-page book of images of this tablet of Kebes. Uh, every artist from, I don't know, at least the Renaissance on has made a representation of it. When I was in Naples this past summer, I saw a huge mural of the tablet of Kebes
Wow.
that somebody had
What's
painted.
what's the original language on this?
It's Greek.
Is it
It's
Greek?
Greek.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's kind of basically classical Greek, but a little bit maybe leaning to Koine Greek, the Greek of the New Testament. So kind of a more common Greek. But yeah, it's basically Greek. It's actually fairly simple Greek because it used to be used as a teaching text back in the day when a lot of people learned ancient Greek. Um, and Yeah, so it's Greek, and that's why I say there's no date on the text that we've got, but from the Greek specialists have kind of dated it. I don't remember. I think to like third or fourth century, if I remember correctly. Um, but it could be, a few centuries earlier or a few centuries later. So one of the interesting things, though, is somebody found a piece of rock that actually has a piece of this tablet on it. Now, let me be
Oh,
clear what I mean.
was
The
that the
image,
pillar that you were talking about in
no, that's
Afghanistan?
not the
Oh,
pillar. No,
oh,
this is it's like if you imagine this whole tablet with this picture on it. So it's
mm,
got this very elaborate picture. And if you search for tablet of Kebes, you'll see if you search online or in Wikipedia, you'll see images of it. So different artists have figured out what it looks like. And of course I got lots of pictures of it in my book. But so if you imagine this sort of ring with all of these different figures moving around through these different rings, a picture like that. Well, somebody hundreds of years ago found a piece of a tablet, um, which obviously is the lower corner of this thing. It fits
wow.
the description exactly. Sadly, that piece of rock has been lost.
Oh my gosh.
We have drawings of it from, I believe, the 1700s, if I remember correctly. But in the ensuing centuries and wars and what have you, it's gone missing. Maybe it's around in a museum drawer somewhere or in somebody's private collection. Who knows?
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, at some point, an actual tablet. Now, it could have been made from the text for all we know, but at some point, an actual stone tablet that fit the description of the text actually existed. So this is one of those cases where we actually have the engraved tablet, or had it anyway.
Yeah.
So anyway, so it's um, but the interesting thing is this text. It you can interpret it at several different levels. And one level is an allegorical level, where it basically is giving you sort of common pagan philosophical advice on how to live a good life. Sort of Platonic, um, sort of Stoic, you know. It's just sort of it's sufficiently unspecific that it kind of fits into a number of different philosophical traditions because they had a lot in common. But there's another deeper level where it's describes more of a theurgical process of ascent uh, and to the higher realms, and I describe that in my book. Um, I've got two books actually. One is just a translation of the Tablet of Kebes, and the other is called Kebe's Path to Enlightenment, and it includes a translation and a commentary which describes these different levels of meaning. And that I think is very interesting because it really does describe if you will, a series of initiations uh, uh, um, into these deeper mysteries.
Mm. So when you were translating this, did you kind of draw from all these various um reproductions of the different images of the tablet and translate from there? Is that kind of how?
Well, no, I translated from the Greek.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, so no, I translated from the Greek. I saw those images because there's some doubt about the interpretation in a couple places. There's even been discussions about, well, are there three rings or are there four rings?
Mm.
And you know, well, yeah, there's there seem to be four rings, but maybe we shouldn't count the outer ring. So there's really only three to count. That sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a few cases where the Greek is a little bit unclear, um, and different artists have interpreted it different ways. So and I talk about all of that in the commentary. But no, I translated from the Greek, and uh, there are other English translations around, so I could check my translation and make sure I got it right. And in some of these questionable places, I put in some footnotes also to try and say, well, it could be this, it could be that. Um, but like I said, it's not super hard as far as ancient Greek goes, um, and maybe it was intended as a school text or a text for young people or something. I don't
Yeah.
know. We see again, we don't really know what it was used for or what its purpose was. It's just one of
And
these texts that's come down to us.
was this the one that?
Thebes, by the way, was an associate of Socrates, a Pythagorean, in fact.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just a random name.
Yeah.
And in fact, the old man says that he understands the tablet because he was taught its meaning by, if I remember this correctly, by the person who put the tablet up, who was a follower of Parmenides.
Wow.
Parmenides, in my opinion, is another example of an ancient Greek shaman, and is generally considered also as in the Pythagorean tradition. So there's very strong Pythagorean hints in the names that are used in the Tablet of Thebes.
Yeah. And was this the one that contained the sayings of the seven sages, or was that a different?
That's different. Yeah, no,
What
that's
what
different.
was that one?
So that um, the we have these texts of they're called the Delphic Maxims or the sayings of the seven sages. And there's 147 of them. They've been called the Greek Ten Commandments, except there's 147 of them.
Ah,
And they're mostly thou shalt instead of thou shalt nots. Um, but so there's these stories that the seven sages, and it's a long story. I can tell if you want, but there's these stories that at the end of this series of events, the seven sages of ancient Greece put up a pillar at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi with all of their wise sayings engraved on it. And you know, like many things, we figure, okay, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but there's no evidence for it. Well, so then we have also some texts much later. I don't remember exactly the dates, but much later, um, where Stobaeus is one of the people, says, well, here's the Delphic Maxims. This is what was engraved on the thing. And it's this list of 147 short little maxims. A lot of them are only a word or two long, or maybe three words. They're all very short, or almost all very short. And he says, here's these Delphic maxims. And you say, okay, but where did this come from? Some list he got somewhere, and he doesn't say he copied it down at Delphi or anything. So where did this come from? So people treated it kind of skeptically and just as a list of these maxims. Well, then the interesting thing you're referring to is many years later, and we're talking 20th century. Um, Somebody found in Turkey a two fragments of a stone pillar. And on the bottom of the pillar, there's a dedication. And the dedication is from one of Aristotle's students. And he says, I copied this from the pillar at Delphi.
wow.
And then The other fragment from the top of the pillar is the first of these Delphic maxims. I don't know if it's just one or a couple of them, I forget now. The bottom of the pillar is fascinating because the stone carver ran out of room for the 147 maxims, and he had to carry the last one over onto the base where the dedication is. And it's the last of these 147. So we've got the beginning and the end of the thing that both match up to this list of 147, and the dedication saying, I copied this at Delphi, and put it up here for the betterment of mankind, you know. So that's pretty good evidence that in fact these things were engraved on a pillar of some sort at Delphi, and in fact are exactly the 147 that Stobaeus lists. And so it's a case where, you know, something, this legend, again, a legendary pillar of wisdom actually existed, and we actually know what it said. So it's in that sense quite remarkable. A number of the things I've written actually um, um, are based on cases where we have ancient wisdom engraved on some piece of rock that actually has survived. You know, as I said, we have so many legends of these things, but we don't have the Emerald Tablet, for example, and we don't know if it really existed. But a number of the things I've written about, we do have the tablet. You know, it actually survives. It's in a museum, or it's in an archaeological park or something like that. And I think that's fascinating when we actually get this ancient wisdom, um, um, and we know that we've actually got it. Doesn't mean the other stuff is bad or worthless, but I think it's nice when we know that this was actually something that uh, our ancient ancestors um, respected and honored.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's 147 short things like follow the gods, you know, don't swear an oath, and on and on and on.
And was this in your Oracles of Apollo book, or what work was
Yes,
this?
that is in my the Oracles of Apollo book teaches again two ancient divinations. Well, uh, let me rephrase that. It teaches it gives two ancient texts that in fact were inscribed on stones. One is the alphabet oracle, where there's an oracle associated with each letter of the Greek alphabet. So, like with rune stones, you cast in some way a letter of the Greek alphabet, and then you can consult this inscription, and it'll tell you what it means. So that's the alphabet oracle. And we have several dozen copies of it in more or less complete form from mostly from the Near East. Then the other thing I teach in the Oracles of Apollo is the Oracle of the Seven Sages. Now it uses these 147 um, maxims um, as an oracle. Now, we don't know that they were used as an oracle in the ancient world. So that's why I say I can't claim it's another authentic oracle, but it is an authentic inscription. And it lends itself very nicely to divination, uh, especially if you want sort of general advice, you know, for what you should focus on today, for example. That's something I've often used it for, is just to draw one oracle or one maxim each day, and give me something to work on for that particular day. Um, and but you know, we do know that various kinds of dice and astragalus divination were used at Delphi, and so it's quite possible that people were using these 147 maxims for divination.
Did you say astragalus? Like the
Str-
root
no, no, no.
or the herb?
Astragalus is a hucklebone, a sheep or hucklebone.
Oh, okay.
Astragalus. Um, yeah, I don't know why the root has is maybe it looks like a knucklebone or something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, in ancient Greek it means a bone. It's
Oh,
a bone from a sheep's ankle or a similar animal.
Was it
So they were used like dice. People would roll them, roll the bones, as a way of playing games or divination.
and so you have a book, Homer and Bones. Is that related to that?
It is. It teaches two other divination systems,
Oh,
both authentic divination systems. One is the Homer Oracle, where you roll three dice, and that gives you one of 216 different verses from the Homeric epics. And so it's that then is your oracle. And the other is a dice oracle, where you roll five dice, or one dice five times, probably is the better way to do it. And again, it has a little oracle text for each different combination that you get when you roll the dice five times. And again, both of those are ancient texts. Well, of course, Homer's text is ancient, but the other text also is engraved on various tablets, again, which survive in multiple copies from the ancient world. And it's an interesting kind of text. It gives you the throw or the roll, and it gives you a patron god or goddess, and then it gives you a several line oracle, which is your answer to your question. Um, Again, the oracles are kind of have different purposes. The dice oracle, and that's rolling the bones in the title, is mostly answers practical questions. These oracles were often set up in town squares or at crossroads. So somebody that was journeying, maybe for business or for on a pilgrimage, or to visit relatives or whatever it might be, might stop and make an offering and do a divination to find out how their journey was going to go. And so it often is giving sort of practical answers to questions like that. The Homer oracle is a little different, because these are just lines from the Homeric epics. And often, by themselves, they might not seem to have much meaning, just one line out of the Iliad or the Odyssey. But we have to remember that in the ancient world, everybody knew the Iliad and the Odyssey backwards and forwards. So when they saw that line, they knew what was going on in the Iliad or the Odyssey when that line came up, and so they would put it in the whole context of what was going on in the epics, and that would be how they would understand the meaning of the oracle. And so in my book, what I do is I give the line from Homer. I give, as I do with all the oracles I've translated, alternative translations of the Greek words, because they have a range of meaning. And so you want to know the full range of meaning when you're interpreting an oracle. And then in the case of the Homer oracle, I talk about what's going on in the Iliad or the Odyssey when this line occurs, and then quote also a few lines before and after it, so you can see the context. So you can say, oh, what's this line about? Oh, this is when uh, Priam is coming to ransom Hector's body, from Achilles, and so it puts it in the context of that whole scene, and then you can understand better the significance of this particular line um, from the Iliad or the Odyssey. So, if we were as familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey as most people in the ancient world were, we wouldn't need that, but most of us aren't.
yeah.
So yeah, that book, uh, and I'll hold it up here briefly, is um, it's yeah, it's almost 400 pages. Um, has a little bit of background information. It has some divination rituals, and then most of it is the text of those two oracles, the Homer oracle and the um, uh, Astragalus oracle. Actually, it's Astragalus oracle. So it's called the Homeromanteon and the Astragalomanteon, to use the Greek words.
It's awesome. Yeah. Okay, so while we're on the subject of oracles, I don't know how much this question might be in your area, but maybe you can lend some insight. Because I was researching the Sibilian Well, I was researching the Sibylline oracles, but then there's like the Sibylline books. And so I was having kind of this confusion because I guess there's the Sibylline oracles, maybe they're like recorded by like the church fathers or something, but then there's the actual like Sibylline books that are talked about. I think maybe there's references with like, I don't know, Cicero or Virgil or something like that. Um, but I guess that there's like a legend that at least one of the Sibyls, I think there was the books was said to be stored at the Temple of Apollo or something like that. Or have you come across any of this?
Yeah. Um, I'm rusty on it. I believe there were 9 Sibyls, if I remember correctly, um, scattered around the Mediterranean. So there was one. Again, I was just at Naples a couple months ago, and there was one there at Cumae, the Cumaean Sibyl,
Oh,
uh,
okay, yeah.
and but there were others in around the Middle East and so forth. So the Sibylline books, the story, as I recall, was that whichever Sibyl it was came to one of the emperors. I think it was,
I think that was the Kuman
or
one, was it?
it
Or
may have been the command one. It may have been the command one.
and they
Um,
gave it to like the last king of Rome or something like that, or
yeah, that's
yeah.
right. And said, I'll sell you these 9 books of oracles for a big sum of money. And he said, hell no. And so she proceeded to burn, if I remember correctly, 3 of them, right? Is that, correct me if I get that
Yeah.
number wrong.
And then she
So
burned
she
more
burned
each
3 of
time or
them.
something. Yeah.
And so she came back again and said, okay, I've got the remaining 6 books. I'll sell you for the same amount of money. And he said, hell no again. And so she burned 3 more. And then so she came back a third time and he said, okay, it's a deal. And he bought the remaining books. I think there were 3 of them, I forget. And so they were kept, the story goes, they were kept I believe the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, but they were kept in Rome. And on when things were really going bad in Rome, they would go and consult the Sibylline books to try and get some advice. And so that's the ancient Sibylline books. Um, I don't recall what happened to them, or if anyone knows what happened to them, but they're long gone as far as I know.
So I guess right now
Um,
we just have the fragments from guys that have mentioned them in the past, just
yeah,
is or something.
yeah. Um, so now there's these books that go under the name of the Sibylline oracles. Um, and as I understand it, and again, it's been a long time since I've read anything about this, that they're believed to be much later. Again, I'm thinking maybe third or fourth century. And they've obviously been worked over by the church fathers so that because they're supposed to be very old, pre-Christian, but they've been worked over so that they're predicting Christianity and so forth. Um, and so it's actually a pretty common trick that lots of people do of, you know, writing a text after the fact and then trying to make it look like it was a prediction from before the fact. So
Yeah.
basically that's what they did. But I don't remember if any of the text itself is thought to be substantially older than that. I know that the texts we have are relatively late. Um, and I don't think anyone thinks they have any connection with the ancient
Mm.
Sibylline books.
Yeah, I
But
thought. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
You probably would know more about it than I do. So go ahead.
I just
What do
thought it
you?
was also interesting too because they're kind of like non-Christian sources that the church fathers like to use to validate their prophecies and something like this. And
Mhm.
I guess they were considered pagan, but that's something I also wanted to ask you because like paganism, it's something that's like really prominent in modern times, and I guess I kind of struggle to place exactly how to define it. Like it almost seems to me like is it like any ritual or practice or belief structures revolving around like spirits and gods, but like at the exclusion of Christianity? Or I don't know, how would you like in your estimation, how would you define what paganism actually is?
Well, paganism, I believe, is usually defined as some version of the pre-Christian religions of the West.
Okay.
That's kind of the way. I mean, pagan uh, uh, is a really a Christian term of abuse. Paganus means
Oh,
bumpkin,
it's
basically.
like an insult or something like that?
Yeah,
Or,
it's an insult.
oh,
But modern pagans have essentially embraced the term.
yeah.
But basically, it was a way that the Christians referred to all of the people that still were following the old beliefs, um, which are predominantly polytheistic, um, and often um, tied to the locality too.
Okay.
So yeah, paganism is generally just refers to the pre-Christian religions of Europe and the West and more generally. Um, that would be in my definition, and I'd probably add that they're predominantly polytheistic.
Hmm.
Um, so um, but nevertheless, I mean, when Christianity was getting started, um, well, first of all, they were competing against these well-established pagan religions. Second of all, there was this very sophisticated philosophical tradition, especially the Platonic tradition, but in general, very sophisticated Western philosophy and and really ancient religions like the Egyptian religion and the Persian religion and Zoroastrian again. Um, so all of these ancient religious traditions that and the Jewish tradition, of course, too, that they were kind of competing against. And so um, one of the things they did was to what they wanted to do was show that um, well, and the other thing was that many of the ideas in Christianity, like the idea of a reborn God, uh, you know, had precedence in the earlier pagan religions. So one of the things they wanted to do was show that all of these ideas that a critic might say, oh, you're just copying different bits and pieces of ancient philosophy and ancient pagan religions. What they wanted to do was say, no, 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 no. These were foreshadows of Christianity, that these prophets, even in other religions, saw that Christianity was coming. And, in some cases, even they kind of stole the idea before Jesus was even born. And so, um, they were trying to essentially diffuse this as a criticism of Christianity by saying that no, 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 this is all of this stuff was leading up to Christianity. All of those ancient pagan philosophers, they were all leading up to Christianity, and all of the ancient oracles they were pointing towards Christianity too. And so, of course, they weren't beyond tinkering with a few texts to make their cases. Well, so I think that's what's going on with the Sibylline oracles. Um, they had this ancient tradition. The texts were conveniently lost, so they could essentially write their own texts that said what they wanted them to say. So they wanted them to look pagan because they wanted them to look pre-Christian, but on the other hand, they wanted them to predict, uh, um, you know, what the Bible was predicting or what the Bible was describing.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's um, it was again they did the same thing again in the Renaissance, with the Prisca Theologia, the so-called ancient theology that was all leading up towards Christianity, and Moses was in there, but also Zoroaster and Pythagoras and everybody else. Um, they wanted to, show sort of a historical inevitability to Christianity.
what is Pristo? What was the word you said?
Prisca Theologia
What does that
just
mean?
means ancient theology.
Oh,
The
okay.
idea that there was an ancient theology that had been known since the mists of time and passed on and has finally developed into Christianity.
Mm.
Um, and so that's where you get these chains of philosophers, where it's trying to show that there's this steady, march toward Christianity, even from pre-Christian times. It was all as the biblical prophets predicted. Is
Yeah.
the idea was to show that it wasn't only the Hebrew prophets, but it was the prophets of all of the other lands were also predicting exactly the same thing.
Yeah,
Um,
one of the things I thought was interesting earlier that you mentioned, the thing with like the Magi showing up at the births of these philosophers, and then you think of the Magi with the story of Jesus, and
mhm.
then isn't there also some similarities about like the births of a lot of the philosophers that are kind of unique as well, or
Yeah, there's usually miracles. So I don't remember the details now, but when Pythagoras was born, there were some portents. I don't remember exactly what they were. And in fact, Pythagoras, his name it refers to the Pythian Apollo. So, there was a story that um, that Pythagoras's mother, I forget her name now, but she was named after Pythian Apollo too. Um, but that Apollo was the father, and that it was if you like, I don't know if it was a virgin birth, but it was a divine birth. And so Pythagoras was in fact a demigod.
mm,
Um, and so, yeah, there are all of these. It's just like with the Buddha, there was the flowers bloomed, the the swans flew in the air, and everything went on when he was born. And so you knew this was not just any ordinary child that was being born. And then there were various other miracles along the line. So yeah, there were these stories were told about, especially about Pythagoras, but also some of the other philosophers as well. I mean, Empedocles had all sorts of stories about him curing plagues. And of course, he supposedly ended his life by jumping into Mount Etna,
oh
um,
yeah,
and which then belched out a bronze sandal. Uh, so yeah, there's all sorts of miracle stories around all of these philosophers. Pythagoras was supposed to have gone into a cave or an underground chamber for 9 years, if I recall correctly. Um,
wow.
and uh, and when he came out, he told everybody everything that happened on Earth in the 9 years he'd been down there. So yeah, all sorts of miracle stories. And like I said, a lot of them, sound, kind of like the whole Jesus story a bit. And Dionysus has a lot of connections with, or a lot of similarities to Jesus.
Yeah.
And they're both sons of God, uh, you know, um, and
Dionysus is fascinating to me. He's somebody that I want to get into studying soon. I don't know too much about him right now, but I really like things with like the celestial hierarchies and stuff like that.
yeah, he's a very interesting figure. He was especially important, and this is surprising to some people, to the Platonists, and to the Neoplatonists, because he was viewed as sort of, there's this famous statement from Plato that the Thyrsus carriers are many, but the Bacchae are few. So, the followers of Bacchus would carry the Thyrsus wand in their processions. So Plato was saying, yeah, lots of people carry the Thyrsus wand around, but there are very few Bacchae. In other words, true initiates in the Bacchic religion.
Oh, so
Uh,
that's what Bacchae refers to is like an initiate of some kind?
That's at least one meaning of
Or
it.
I guess
They-
a Bacchian initiate specifically or something?
Exactly.
Okay.
Bacchus is another name for Dionysus. So the Bacchae
Oh,
were
okay. Yeah.
they had essentially become images, if you like, of Bacchus.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot, and unfortunately, a lot of it is buried in scholarly works right now. But I do talk about it a little bit. I've actually got a chapter or a section in my Plethon book about exactly that phrase and what it means, because um, Bacchus has a very important role to play in Plethon's religion too, and um, so he's essentially he's the god that leads us up in the ascent, which is again exactly what Plato says. But again, most people would say, no, Bacchus, he's the party guy. He's the guy that's down here on earth, getting drunk and having fun. But he's also the one that leads us up to his father, Zeus.
Mm.
Um,
All right, I have just a couple more questions and then we'll
yeah.
wrap it up. One I wanted to ask you, was it the book of Kebes where you were discussing like these three different levels of wisdom? Um, you had it kind of broken down. I thought it was cool. I wanted to see if you could elaborate. I think one of them was like stoic. I don't remember the other.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, this is something I've talked about a little bit before, that um I've often described 3 degrees of wisdom. Um, and they're like 3 degrees of initiation, but they're really 3 degrees of more advanced spiritual practice. The lowest degree is Epicureanism. And most people, unless they've studied ancient Epicureanism, they don't uh, quite get what the point is. The point is not to eat, drink, and be merry. That's not what Epicureanism is about. Epicureanism is about understanding your desires and how you can truly be happy, uh, how you can guarantee your happiness. And part of that is realizing how little it takes to be happy and contented. So it's not about eating more fancier food, for example, uh, but enjoying simpler food uh, more. Um, so Epicureanism was kind of looked down upon by the other philosophers in the ancient world, but I think it's still an important lesson for many people today to really kind of break out of consumerism and sort of just conspicuous consumption and things like that. Uh, so the second degree of wisdom then is Stoicism, which again is widely misunderstood, but it's more understood now because there's a whole modern Stoicism movement that teaches it as a practical way of life today. And I think that has a lot to recommend it. So what I would say is when you kind of internalize the Epicurean teachings, then move on to Stoicism, which Epicureanism says withdraw from the world because the world is just a pain in the ass and it causes a lot of trouble. So just sit in your garden, be contented with the basically surviving on what little you can and enjoy it. Stoicism says, no, you're part of the human family, you're part of the human organism. You need to be engaged in reality and in trying to make the world a better place for yourself and everyone else. And so Stoicism teaches you the true sources of your freedom, where you're free to act, where you're not free to act, and how to essentially um, um, exercise your freedom and feel satisfied that you've exercised your freedom. So it helps you to be a productive person in the world better, I think. But it has a very impoverished notion of divinity. And I think Stoicism goes only so far. And in particular, when people start having spiritual interests, doubts, concerns, whatever it may be. And this often happens in the second half of life when you start to realize, okay, I'm on the way out now. I was on the way in, but now I'm on the way out sooner or later. and what is it? What was it all for? And what is it? Is the rest of it going to be for? People start having this is the midlife crisis. This people start thinking about what's really important, and so that's where I think we want to come in contact with the gods, and that's where I think the third degree of wisdom, then I would say, is Neoplatonism, because not only does it give you a cosmology in which there are gods that are actually involved in our lives, which in Stoicism, there are gods, but they're not particularly involved in our lives. It gives you gods that are involved in our lives, and particularly, I think, a polytheistic view of gods, which I think is very important for psychological health. And then via theurgy, it gives you a way of actually engaging with those gods. And I think that's very important. So that's why I consider Neoplatonism to be sort of the third degree of wisdom. And in fact, there's some ancient um, support for this sort of three-tiered system, because in the ancient world where Neoplatonism was being taught, so from in the first few centuries CE, um, Stoicism was also just sort of the general philosophy that kind of everybody practiced. So anyone coming to a teacher to learn Neoplatonism already would have internalized Stoic practices, and so they would be sort of beginning at that base level and be looking for something more advanced. And so that's why I've also structured things in those three degrees of wisdom, as I sometimes call them, like that. Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Neoplatonism. Um, some people, because of course, in the ancient world, these three philosophies and various sects within them were all fighting with each other, as philosophies will, because they want to exaggerate the differences between themselves and other philosophies. But actually, they have a great deal in common in terms of sort of the basic way of life, which I think is important for us in our world now. Um,
Yeah, I love it. I feel like I actually really resonate with that too personally. I was definitely into, Stoicism for a while with like Seneca and I think Epictetus.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, there's just kind of that missing element that I definitely think you're 100% spot on with the Neoplatonic traditions and stuff. That's kind of that pulling component. So I love it. Okay, I got one last question for you. Um, with I don't know. I just don't know. I'm curious about like, so we have the muses. I don't know how many of the muses there are. Is it seven or something like? I don't know.
I think nine is the usual number,
Nine.
but
Okay.
there's different lists. So it's one of those things where there's sort of nine
Yeah.
canonical ones.
So we talk about invoking the muse. That's kind of like a singular thing. But I wonder, are there any historical practices of like working with the specific individual muses, like working and invoking individual muses historically that you've come across?
Let me think. There, the reason I'm really pausing is there may be a hymn of Proclus to the Muses. Um, I would have to double check that, but I have in the back of my mind that one of his theurgical hymns is to the Muses.
Oh, interesting.
There are also Orphic hymns, as I recall, to the Muses. And these are all fairly late. Um, I think when Homer or some poet invokes, says, "Sing to me, muse," about blah blah blah, we should take that quite literally. Um, Now we don't know what they did. They may have just said a little prayer. They may have burned some incense. Maybe they sacrificed a cow. Yeah, we don't know. But I think we should take it quite literally that when an ancient poet, sat down to write or to sing, uh, that they invoked the muse. Because they invoked the gods for everything. That the gods were an essential part of their life. So the muses would certainly, and I mean, they're assigned, there's one muse for history, there's a muse for lyric poetry, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
So exactly the genres that people were writing in, there's a muse for each of them. So I think um, when they say, sing muse about such and such, I think we should take that quite literally. Now they don't say which muse. Well, they probably mean their personal muse, so it may be one of the named ones. But again, the lists are not entirely consistent. So, um, I don't know where the canonical list we have comes from, but um, I do know there are multiple lists of the muses, and um, often, you will see an invocation for the god, or the goddess, and it doesn't name who it is, either because it's obvious or because they were speaking to a deity more personally that they were in contact with. And so, um, yeah, I don't know when Homer say or Hesiod invokes a muse. I don't know whether it's one of the canonical ones or whether it's some muse that they're in particular contact with. But I would expect that a professional, if you want to put it that way, a professional poet would have an intimate personal relationship with at least one muse. Um, and that would have been cultured over many years, and perhaps a different muse for different activities. Um, so I think we should take that quite literally. But I think they would have been doing the usual sort of probably prayers and sacrifices that they would do to any god. If it was maybe they would have found out, or have by tradition, that a particular offering was welcomed by a particular muse. Um, we have that stuff with the Orphic hymns, for example, but again, it's very late. We don't know if if the offerings of different incenses were traditional or just somebody made them up out of their head. We just don't know in some of these cases. Um, you know,
Okay, Elliot, I have one more question. Um,
uh-huh. Sure.
what is a book that you would really love to see translated into English that hasn't yet been translated?
Well, I'll answer the question slightly differently, but Proclus's Platonic theology. It has been translated into English by Thomas Taylor. Uh, as some people say, Thomas Taylor's English is harder to read than the Greek.
Uh, so we need a new good
So
fresh translation.
yeah, we need a good fresh translation. And um, I yeah, that would
Awesome.
be something I would really like to have, because I have the Thomas Taylor translation, and I kind of
Yeah.
dread every time I have to go into it. But
I have it. I haven't opened it yet, but I did just get it about a month or so ago. So
yeah, yeah. Well, good luck. It's a spiritual practice in itself.
yeah.
But yeah, I would. Well, also, I mean, because it not only is his English kind of hard to read, it's a very Greekish English,
Mm.
uh, but also there's been a lot of work on the text since him then, and so I would really like a fresh translation of a good modern edited text, and there is a good modern edited text, but it's in Greek. So and that's a lot of Greek to translate. So I'm
Seems like a task for sure.
yeah, I'm waiting for some Greek scholar to do that
Yeah.
for us.
Well, this was amazing. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. Where would you direct people to find out more about yourself or your work?
Okay, the best place to go is my webpage. It's opsopaus.com. That's opsopaus.com. And that has information on my books, uh, several books on Plethone, the Tablet of Kebes we've talked about, Oracles of Apollo. and the divination systems, all of that stuff, and more too, I might say. And it also has links to my ancient 1990s vintage website where I have a lot of my writing still out there too.
What's that website called?
Bibliotheca Arcana.
That's a cool name. I like that.
Yeah, yeah. It was connected actually to the Omphalos, which was a neo-pagan networking group for people following Greek and Roman neo-pagan traditions. That back in the day, it was originally done in through postal mail, but
Wow.
then when the internet came, we moved it onto the internet, and it was because there were so few of us. It was so we could get together to do rituals and trade rituals and stuff like that, and so that it's all been really superseded by the internet and lots of books and stuff now, but
Yeah.
still out there.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for all of your contributions. Greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely.